it's a matter of time before the world, and let me just say this, before the world realizes the single greatest proof of the Bible, like the golden chalice of biblical archaeology, the Exodus itself, the sea crossing, all of the evidence is right there. It's actually like the biggest story in biblical archaeology, and this is going to sound sensational, but in history, and it's actually right in front of us. It's sort of unfolding as we speak.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to another show of No Longer Nomads. I'm your host, Josh Doyle, and today we have a prophecy expert on the show. I am fired up to have Joel Richarsdon on the program. And Joel, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, Josh, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, right off the bat, so we went to Saudi Arabia in 2020, and the main reason we went was because of you. And my parents had read your book, and I know they know you. And when we went, it was like a fresh snow drift that was completely untouched. I mean, we could walk right up to Split Rock, which we'll probably get into that to explain that to our listeners. We walked right up it. We climbed through it, got to hike up Jabal el-Lawz, which we'll be able to unpack a little bit as well. But man, super thankful to have you here and excited for this conversation.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I love your parents. They're easy to love. And it was super cool, actually, because they came on the first sort of official tour that I was able to just have the opportunity to lead into Saudi Arabia. And to think about this, Josh, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was closed. I mean, closed to tourism. In order to get in, you're either going to get in through a job, work visa, or through the military or this type of thing. We brought in the first official sort of non-Muslim Hajj tour group in the history of the country. Gosh. And your parents were able to be part of that. And it was beautiful. I will say, I actually remember, because, your parents, for those who watch this, probably know your folks. They just love people, they love Muslims. And they actually came to Saudi, not because they were really interested in the mountain, because they just wanted to get into Saudi Arabia and meet Saudi Arabians. They were just excited. Yeah. And I was standing there at one point, and your dad goes, "Joel, this really is Mount Sinai." And I was like, I told you it really is. And he's like, "No, like it really, really is." And I was like, I'm telling you, it sells itself. Once you actually get there and see it, it's an amazing thing to behold. It really is.
That's so cool. I would love to start there. So we had required reading on the trip, and it was this book, Mount Sinai in Arabia, by you, and it was a great read, and I learned so much about the mountain, and I had no idea, like I was saying, when we went there, it was just, I wanted to get into Saudi Arabia as well. It's been closed for centuries, and wow, I can't believe we're here. And then also, another thing I noticed was just how hospitable they were, and we've bounced all around the Middle East, and I've done a lot of trips throughout, but man, getting to Saudi Arabia was just like a bucket list item. And so getting there was incredible. And then we get to see the Split Rock. We also get to we said, hey, can we potentially camp out at the base of this mountain and maybe try to summit it the next day? And so then we did, we're staying at the tent and then as the sun comes up that first morning, and we get to see the mountain, the Almond Mountain. You can explain about that. It was incredible. I mean, you could see the top of the mountain, Charred, and it was like, this looks like it is the place. And then as we were digging more and more into your book, it's just like, my goodness, you see so much that points to this could be the actual place. It feels like the actual place, but I'd love to hear from you. Why do you think it's the actual place? And I'd love to even hear a bit about why the traditional place is a traditional place.
Yeah. So in fact, I'm thinking back, the first time that we camped out at the base of the mountain actually was on that trip. And the Bedouins who serve as our tour guides, they were kind of just getting things going. So they had bought a bunch of these little tents, these little sort of pop-up tents.
Okay.
And beforehand, everyone had to decide as to whether or not they wanted to camp out or stay back at the hotel, which is a couple hours drive. And there was only a few people that had said they don't want to camp. Last minute, they said, actually, this is super cool. We want to do it. But we didn't have enough tents. So because I was the leader, I the Bedouins had a bunch of the Bedouin rugs, right, that you just lay on the sand. So I literally just took a couple carpets and I rolled myself up like a burrito and just slept outside. That was the first time we ever camped out. But in terms of the reason why, well, so let's just say the foundation for believing that this is the real Mount Sinai, as opposed to the traditional site, because there are a handful of different candidates out there. The traditional site and Jebel Oz, these are not the only candidates. There's another one, for example, it's very popular in Israel, Har Karkum, that's down there in the Negev. A lot of Israelis will visit that place. And there's a few others. Of the different candidates, Jebel Oz in Saudi Arabia is the only candidate. It's the only option that has a very clear, ancient, first century and older Jewish tradition that says it's Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Because essentially what you have is you have Josephus and Philo. Josephus, of course, historian in Jerusalem in the first century during the fall of Jerusalem. Everyone knows Josephus. And then you had Philo. He was over there in Alexandria. So two different parts of the Jewish world. He was in much more of the Hellenistic sort of side of the Jewish world in Egypt. Both of them in the first century state that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain in the region of Midian. And overwhelming academic consensus is the land of Midian during the time of the Exodus was northwest Saudi Arabia. So once you start there and you begin working from there, and you realize once you get over there, of course, that this ancient tradition, it's unbroken. It was never lost. It's still maintained and preserved by the locals, the Bedouins, the Saudi Arabians that live there. They all say, yeah, this is the mountain of Moses. This is the land of Midian. This is where Jethro lived. This is where Moses lived. And these traditions, they go all the way back to this ancient Jewish tradition. But unfortunately, the church or the Christians have lost that tradition. And the reason is because in the 4th century, when you had the monastic movement that started out of Egypt with Anthony and, the Desert Fathers, they started going out into the Sinai Peninsula, into the desert to fast, to pray, to seek the Lord. And there was just really, honestly, some confusion because you have this piece of property, if you will, the Sinai Peninsula. It's sort of, you look at a map, it's shaped like a piece of pizza. Yep. I always point that out because it helps Americans to remember.
Yeah, we can understand that.
But it's surrounded by these sort of two tongues of bodies of water, if you will. Look for your audience here, on this side, your right, my left is the Suez Canal. On the other side is the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, these are both part of what's called the Red Sea, but there's confusion. In ancient history, when you look at a lot of maps, there's not really two tongues. They just kind of have one with this little branch off of it. It's almost like there was confusion regarding the layout of the Sinai Peninsula. So in any case, they just wrongly pointed to the tallest mountain in Sinai, and they said, oh, this must be Mount Sinai. This must be Mount Sinai. And this is the reason why the Sinai Peninsula is now called the Sinai. And so basically what happened is these monks, they were getting killed, massacred by the Saracens, the Bedouins that, they were pre-Islam, that lived out there. And eventually Emperor Justinian basically built a fortress. So here you have the Roman Emperor, Justinian, builds a fortress to protect the monks, and he names it St. Catherine's Monastery of the God-trodden mountain. And so basically the Roman Empire put their stamp of approval on the other mountain. And ever since then, that's what Christian tradition has said. And we basically lost the real mountain. And so it's beautiful that in this hour, the Lord's sort of bringing attention back to the real thing.
Yeah. Wow. So if you go to the mountain in Saudi Arabia, which is, you look at the route, it just makes a lot more sense the way that the Israelites would have traveled as well. Do you mind breaking that down a bit as well? Just the way they would have crossed the Red Sea. Just it seems to be that would be a much more likely area versus some of the traditional routes. And also, like you said, they just put all throughout Israel. We face this all the time. Team members will come up and say, wow, is this actually the place where this happened? It's like, well, this is a traditional site, but it could be in this vicinity. Well, with Mount Sinai, I mean, there's a big question mark where it could be. So I'd love to hear the route, why you think this makes even more sense for this to be the actual location.
Yeah, so it's fascinating, Josh. I one of the ways that my brain works is I'm fascinated by the structure and the logic of an argument, and it's just my mind's always working around logic. And so when you look at the history of the development of the logic behind the traditional site, so first you started out with these monks that just said, oh, this is the tallest mountain in the area, it must be Mount Sinai. So you have the birth of a wrong idea. Then later, what you have is Western academic scholars trying to justify this wrong idea. So you have compounding error. So what they tried to do, once they determined that Mount Sinai was in the Sinai Peninsula, then they said, oh, so that means the sea crossing, the most magnificent miracle in the Bible, it didn't happen over there at the Gulf of Aqaba, crossing into Saudi Arabia. No, it happened over here on the other side, on the western side, in the Suez. So what you have is, let's say over 100 years of Western scholarship trying to justify the sea crossing at this place. The Bible describes it as the depths of the sea, the Yam Suf. That's the ocean. It describes it as the ocean being ripped in half and so forth. You go over there to the Suez, it was this shallow marsh. And so you have this sort of Western academic effort to justify a biblical story using a very naturalist perspective. They don't want to believe in a real miracle. They want to believe the wind blew. It was just kind of a natural thing that happened. So that's where the traditional site is, and that's the emphasis of scholarship, again, over the past 100 years. The problem is when you look at, for example, the writings of Josephus, he describes the topography of the sea crossing. He says the Egyptians were up on these very tall mountain precipices looking down at the Israelites that were trapped between the ocean and the beach, and the Egyptians at their back. Yeah. Well, Josephus described that in the first century. There are no tall mountains on the Suez side. There's maybe 100-foot hills, nothing. On the other side, where you have Wadi Watir, you have Nuweiba Beach, Josephus described Nuweiba perfectly. I mean, to a T. And so you have to begin there. You have to say either the first century Jews already had lost the location of Mount Sinai. Josephus was completely wrong, because it's very common in academia to say, well, Josephus was not a reliable witness because he had a bias toward the Romans. You go, fine. You always have to acknowledge the bias of any witness. But sure, why would he lie about something so basic and fundamental to Jewish identity? There's no reasoning for that. They can't come up with a logical explanation for that. So this is a big part of the debate when you get into it, is just simply where was the crossing? And if the Bible is to be believed, it was on the side of the Gulf of Aqaba, because that is in fact an ocean. It's a sea. It's not some little shallow marsh that the wind could have just blown exceedingly strong that night and pushed it back, and then Pharaoh and his armies drown in this little shallow marsh. It's a silly story, quite frankly. It's almost an insult to our intelligence, but it's very common, unfortunately, in the academic world.
So have you received much pushback from your claim this is the mountain? I mean, I'm sure just with anything, there's always pushback, but have you received that? If so, what is that like?
Okay, so again, within the world of academia and biblical archaeologists, in fairness, these guys are legitimate, credentialed. They put in the time. They've also put in hundreds of thousands of dollars into their degrees. And then what you had was this sort of popular, sensational, arguably questionable character back in the 80s. His name was Ron Wyatt. He was the first one in modern times to sort of start highlighting this mountain. And the reason he did that, by the way, was he was studying these books from the late 1800s by these different French, British explorers, and they weren't particularly focused on the location of Mount Sinai, but it does come up. And these are, explorations in the land of Midian and different things. So he was reading these things, and he goes, the traditional site, that doesn't make sense. This other mountain over here in Saudi, so he snuck in again in the 1980s. He got arrested and so forth.
Yeah.
And so it's a pretty interesting story. But the guy went on to make all these claims that he saw the Ark of the Covenant under the Temple Mount, and all these different things that just sound really dubious.
Yeah.
And so you get these credentialed scholars, they look at this popular American guy, adventurer, and they go, this is ridiculous. He's making claims that are silly. And so that's sort of been the standard for, whatever, the past 20, 30 years. I had the opportunity, now that it's open, a few years ago, to bring Eli Shukran there. Eli is one of Israel's most legendary, credentialed biblical archaeologists. I mean, the guy is renowned.
Yeah.
And, I didn't try to convince him. In the same way with your dad, he just looked at it and went, my goodness, like, this really is Mount Sinai. I just said the mountain sells itself. And anyone who is an archaeologist, they're going to look at it. So I didn't really even try to push anything. I just let him see everything. He came back several months later, and this time he advertised it all over his Facebook. Eli Shukran, Joel Richardson going to Mount Sinai. That's a big professional sort of step. And so I remember on the second trip, someone asked him, they said, Eli, do you believe this is the real Mount Sinai? And he said, I believe it's the best candidate. Again, he has to be careful. He's a real scholar, but he said of all the different candidates, this is by far the best candidate. So now I have viewed my role in this as I've taken the baton from Ron Wyatt, who is, a popular sensationalist type of guy. I think I have a little bit more credibility. I'm a bit more careful in the way I approach things, but I'm not an actual scholar. Sure. I've taken the baton from him, and now I'm passing it to people like Eli Shukran. And there's a handful, I won't say all their names, but there are a handful of legitimate credentialed archaeologists now that are very interested in it, who are clamoring to get there. And there's a few, by the way, that are actually employed by NEOM in Saudi Arabia that are doing digs there and this type of thing. So it's just a matter of time, Josh. Yeah. It's a matter of time before the world, and let me just say this, before the world realizes the single greatest biblical, the single greatest proof of the Bible, like the golden chalice of biblical archaeology, the Exodus itself, the sea crossing, all of the evidence is right there. It's actually like the biggest story in biblical archaeology, and this is going to sound sensational, but in history, and it's actually right in front of us. It's sort of unfolding as we speak. That's
amazing. I was looking at your book last night, and I was just, it took me back to when we were there hiking the mountain. And so I'd love to hear, so we talked about the crossing. I'd love to hear a few more things of why this could be the place. I mean, Split Rock, would love to get into that. And then also I'd love to talk about Golden Calf, and then where Moses would have talked to his elders up. There's a flat spot up on Sinai. I think it's like Exodus 28 or something. They talk about a sapphire stone. I remember running around looking for the stone up there. And I mean, and then lastly, I'd love to also talk about, and we can kind of section off here, but I'd love to also talk about the top of the mountain. I mean, you look at it from a distance, you go, wow, that is clearly another color than the rest of the mountain. It is dark, it looks like it's burnt. And I'd love to see, I'd love to talk through all those, details that point to, wow, this could actually be the place. And you look at the desert itself and just goes, this could be a place that could hold 1 million people. A bunch of Israelites could actually be housed here. So I'd love to hear any of those, wherever you want to take it with Golden Calf or any of that stuff.
Yeah. So overwhelmingly, whether we're talking topography, whether we're talking geology, whether we're talking geography, just the general location, time distances, whether we're talking archaeology, like actual altars, petroglyphs, all of these things, it all lines up. Everything fits hand in glove. Now, let me say something with regard, because this comes up a lot with regard to the idea of the top of the mountain being charred. So when you look at the mountain, the lower portion is granite, so it's a lighter tan type of granite. The top is much darker. And this really, it's fascinating, and it really grabs, a lot of people go, wow, the top of the mountain is burnt. I approach this with a lot of caution.
Sure.
So I'm not a geologist. I'll simply say that, there have been folks, I've got, a handful of rocks that I brought back. They've been tested and so forth. So the The rocks down below are, in fact, granite. It's a type of dirty granite. It's sort of a very porous granite, which is it's a volcanic type of rock. And then the top is basalt, volcanic basalt, also volcanic. There's just a difference in terms of the silica content. I don't understand it. But the point is this, is the top dark because it was burnt by the presence of God? And that's possible. The problem is, and this is my hesitancy, is that you see throughout the region, you see other seams of basalt and granite. You'll see like a mountain, and it almost looks like, I always liken it like God just took one of the different types of rock, like strews, like on a pastry with icing. He just drizzles it. You see different types of minerals strewn about. So it's hard to know whether this is just a natural formation or if it has something to do with, the events that took place there.
Interesting. So there's other places around there, similar basalt stones, color. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I have to be honest and fair about that. So I'm very cautious, but it grabs you. You go, to the appearance of the sons of Israel, the top of the mountain was like a consuming fire. It was smoke and, this type of thing. So it's definitely fascinating. I'll put it that way. But let's get down to the real issues in terms of why we believe it's the real Mount Sinai. So first of all, it is the single tallest mountain in the region. And so you have, again, academic consensus says this is the region of Midian, where Moses would have been. You get there's issues, for example, like where would Moses have lived with Jethro? Well, you have a town there called Al-Bed in Arabic. You could say Al-Bad or Al-Bed. And it's a oasis town. So it's a town with water, with palm trees and this sort of thing. It has springs. And it also sits on the only major highway, sort of the ancient Arab caravan route from the south. It would have gone up towards Syria and Egypt and so forth. And so this would have been the natural place where people would have lived. Well, when you go there today, the locals, there's actually a sign in Arabic that basically says this is Jethro's house. They call it the Caves of Jethro or the Caves of Shu'aib. They call them in Arabic. And there in the town are caves that they call the Caves of Jethro. These are ancient Midianite burial caves. There's actually a well there in the center of town that's ancient. You've got records of it going back well over 1,500 years to, like the early foundations of Islam. They call it the Well of Moses. So, you just look at this and everything is laid out. You go, if this is where the well was, where Moses met Zipporah, his future wife, drove off the shepherds, you have the story in the Bible, then you go, this makes sense. This is where people would have lived. They would have lived where there was water. They would have lived on the major Arab caravan route. And then when you look at the writings, for example, of Claudius Ptolemy, he's a Roman geographer, the father of modern geography. He calls this town on the eastern shores of the Gulf of Aqaba in modern-day Saudi Arabia. In the first century, Ptolemy referred to it as Midian. He called this town a city called, or he calls it Madian. It's a very subtle variant of Midian. And so you go, this is like overwhelmingly the most likely place where Moses would have lived with his father-in-law for 40 years. And from that town, you can look right out and see the peak of Mount Sinai. So details like this, when you look at the mountain itself, okay, so the temple, because we need to remember, the mountain is actually a prototype of the temple itself. Okay, so the temple in Jerusalem, it faces perfectly east. The mountain itself also faces perfectly east. And at the base of it, you have an altar made with clearly, a massive long, it's sort of like a corral with an altar at the end. The Saudis excavated it in the early 90s. It has everything that you would expect to find if it was an altar with animal sacrifices. They found charcoal, ash, the remains of bones and organic matter up at the end.
Yep, I remember seeing that. What was cool, Joel, it was just me and and a few other people that wanted to hike, and then our guide who didn't speak any English. In fact, he didn't even know how to get to the top of the mountain. He was bad. He was sick, but we were about 3/4 of the way up, and we're like, we got to get to the top before, we're not going to make it down, And so we actually ended up somebody and he got up afterwards. But even he grew up at the base and didn't even know to get to the top. We kind of made our way there. But I remember looking at this altar, and I was like, man, I wish we had someone like you there that could point out, because we were going around just for about 20 minutes looking at everything. So yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because I certainly remember seeing that before our hike.
Yep. And it's exactly, look, it says in Exodus that the rocks are to be made not cut by human hands. So you have an altar made with stones that are not cut by human hands. Right next to it are 12 pillars, which is exactly what the Bible describes. Deuteronomy says there's a river that comes down the mountain right next to the altar. It's right there, clearly. It's mostly a dry river bed today, but in the winter it does actually run. A couple hundred yards from that is this large rock outcropping structure that's covered with petroglyphs of cows. Now, the critics, again, the scholars, they go, oh, these are just pastoral scenes. These were done by farmers. There's other examples of cows in Saudi Arabia. And you go, okay, the problem is there are very specific imagery in these petroglyphs. Unique, specific imagery. For example, there's one of a person, he's underneath the cow with his hands up in the air like this. Well, you can see these exact designs. Again, these are not things that farmers do, but you can see these precise designs in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. This is religious iconography. It's portraying the worship of these cow gods. And you go, that's right there where the Bible says the golden calf altar would have been. And you go, okay, if this is not the real Mount Sinai, it's almost like someone's punking us. It's like, but it's been sitting here for thousands of years. So it's like the biggest scam in human history. A couple miles up from the mountain is a massive cemetery that the locals refer to as the cemetery of the Yehudis, of the Jews. Saudi Arabia is excavating that right now. That would have been probably where they buried the 3,000 rebels with the golden calf situation. As I said, the mountain faces east. Now, when we went the first time, actually my first two trips, I didn't make it up to the plateau. The second time I did. And so this really blew me away, because when you read the biblical narrative, it seems to portray a two-tiered mountain, a mountain that has two tiers or two peaks, because you have the account where after the covenant is made, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 representative elders of Israel, it says they go up to the top of the mountain. It says they ate and drank, and then they looked up and they saw God's feet. But then Moses goes all the way up. See, well, it says they're on the top of the mountain, but Moses goes all the way up to the top of the mountain. And so when you get there, the mountain itself, you've got this big peak here, but in front of it, it's essentially like a bowl.
Yeah.
So you have to come up over this ridge, and then you're in the bowl, and it's this massive plateau, probably the size of a football field or bigger, in kind of an oval shape. And then you have the ultimate peak. And so when I saw that the first time, I went, surely, like, this is exactly what you would expect to find simply reading the biblical text. So the very topography, the layout of the mountain itself validates the biblical narrative. So whether it's the archaeological features, the petroglyphs, the layout of the mountain itself, ancient Jewish tradition, the tradition of the locals, like everything just compounds and builds, and the case for it is really overwhelming.
Wow, that's fascinating. And Moses was a bad dude to be able to go up and down multiple times. I mean, it took us, Joel, probably 12 hours. Granted, we did get lost, and so what we did was we went up from the plateau, probably, I don't know which direction we were coming up, but we went basically down into that riverbed you were talking about. And when we came down, we kept getting cliffed out, so we'd have to go up and down. And we finally made it down to the base. I mean, that is a rugged mountain. I grew up in Colorado, and I loved hiking, climbing, and we take teams to do 14ers from time to time, and this was like a 14er in a way. I mean, it was a rugged mountain. It's not like a easy stroll up to the top. And so anyways, what about the Split Rock? We went there, fascinating site, and there's a lot of evidence that points to this could be the actual place where Moses split the rock.
Yeah, and so the Split Rock is it's another location attached to the mountain. It was found by Jim and Penny Caldwell back in the 90s, and it's essentially, let's just say, apart from the biblical narrative, it's a very unique rock formation. You have just this ginormous. I've estimated it's about 20 meters plus tall, 65 feet or so tall. This rock just perched precariously on top of this giant pile of rocks that's probably well over 100 feet plus tall.
Yeah.
And it's split right down the middle. So when you read the biblical narrative, there are a few specific requirements for the split rock to be the split rock. One is the Lord says to Moses, he says, Moses, go and stand before the rock at Horeb. So Horeb is just sort of an alternative name for Sinai. Sometimes you'll see the word Horeb, sometimes you'll see Sinai. But the point is, this particular rock was known as the rock at Horeb. Now, the reason this matters is because when you go there is in the range of about 10 to 10 billion gajillion rocks. Okay. Yeah. So there's just rocks everywhere. That's all there is rocks. Yeah. In order to be the rock at Horeb, you have to stand out. This thing was a prominent landmark. It was something that was well known. It was unique. It was distinct. And this particular rock matches that criteria. It's a very unique formation. And then it has, again, all of the distinct features that the Bible describes. It's split down the middle.
Yep.
It has what appears to be massive water erosion. I mean, I'm not a geologist, but it certainly looks that way. And it's in the right location. And so you go, could this be the split rock? It very well may be. It might not be. It could just be an incredible coincidence. But this is at a place called Rephidim, which is what the Bible describes as where Israel fought the Amalekites. Now, this is really fascinating, because when you really get into the biblical text, and you realize that the Amalekites were probably among the giant clans. They probably were, sort of downgraded versions of Goliath, if you will. We don't know exactly how big they were, but they were probably much bigger than the Israelites, and Israel fought them in a battle. And when I actually went there the first time, I found a few paintings, which are different, by the way. The paintings are different than the petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are chipped into the rock, like with a rock, through this dark varnish that forms on the rocks. The paintings are actual paintings. Okay. And they're only in caves and on undersurfaces. And I found a big mural of a bunch of archers, but I also found a mural of what appears to be a battle between giants and normal-sized people. And you go, wow, that very well could be depicting the battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites. So it's just things like this. It's like example after example after example. There's just so much evidence. There's so many fascinating things. And it's a very credible possibility that this could be the real place of the split rock. And what's amazing about that, by the way, is it's not like when you go to Israel, you go, okay, this is where Paul did a miracle. This is where Jesus did a miracle. Right. You go to Saudi Arabia and it's like, this is not just where God did a miracle. There it is. That's the miracle. Yeah. It's just sitting there on a pedestal. If it's not the real split rock, to me, it's kind of like the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. It just feels like it is, and it feels anointed. I don't know how else to say it. It's a special place.
Man. So, kind of last question here on Saudi Arabia. I'd love to get to some stuff in Israel as well. I remember, when I first started taking teams to Israel, my brother and I, we were taking groups, and we would tell them like, oh man, there's been documentation of people scuba diving in the Red Sea and seeing chariot wheels and all that. I mean, that's been going on for decades, but do you know if there's any proof that there has been, in fact, some artifacts recovered in the Red Sea? I mean, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. So again, this was Ron Wyatt made these claims. He claims to have seen chariot wheels, and his sons claim the same. And I think they do have some credibility. Now, the problem is the location is forbidden in Saudi Arabia. You're forbidden to go swimming, to go scuba diving. In fact, the reason is it's a massive smuggler's route from Egypt. They're smuggling people, drugs, all kinds of things. I actually almost got killed there a few years ago, but the Saudi border patrol. But they mistook us for smugglers. But there definitely have been the claims. There was another, so there's been 3 trips that I'm aware of. There was another one. He was a Swedish scientist, spacing on his name right now. He went with another woman, and they did some pretty good exploration with some video. And there seems to be coral formations that do appear to be, what looks like an axle, a chariot axle on its side, like coral formations that look like a big, almost like a lollipop or something like that. Yeah. The problem is, if these are chariot wheels, they're covered with thousands of years of coral. So they need underwater X-ray machines. Here's the neat thing, Josh, is up until just a couple years ago, we didn't have readily available technology. Nowadays, you can buy an underwater drone for a couple $1,000 that's capable of going down 100 feet, recording video footage. We can go underwater with robotic X-ray machines. So we have the ability to do, we know the location, we have the ability to do the exploration. We just need permission from the Saudis. And so if we can do that again, if we actually did find something, it would be unquestionably the single biggest story in the history of biblical archaeology, period, bar none. It would change the world. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that they can give us permission to do that. And wow. There's a lot of folks clamoring to try to get there. I would counsel anyone who's watching this, don't sneak. Don't try to do it sneakily. They've got cameras.
Is that what happened? Is that what you guys did? Was it and no. Potentially? No. Okay.
No. We were just there. We had come out through something. It's called this big sort of wadi, if you will. Wadi Taib al-Ism is what they call it, which just basically means the valley with a nice name. Yeah. And we had come through that, and we went swimming, and it was at night. And the Saudis thought we were smugglers and came out with a big military contingent. And the commander told his men to shoot us, and thankfully they didn't. And but
that's crazy, man. Golly. Well, let's jump over to Israel. There's so much going on, and by the time this episode comes out, it'll already be dated. But let's put at least a little bit of a timestamp on this here. And currently, we're in the middle of the hostage deal, and they have let a couple waves of hostages out. And so, a show geared towards parents, a show geared towards young families. I'd love to hear your take on just how, October 7th, right? And how brutal that massacre was. We went there in December of that year and just were able to go down to the kibbutzim down there and just see everything that was just torn up and destroyed by, it was evil. It was just pure evil. These men coming out of Gaza there. So would love to hear your take on everything going on currently there and what you anticipate, just kind of geopolitically with other powers in play. I've heard some interesting takes, like Egypt will potentially be the one to govern Gaza, and as a peace plan. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. I'd love to hear your take on everything there.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't know exactly how it's all going to play out. I was actually in Saudi on October 7th, right up there by the border, and it was beyond devastating. This past April, we had the chance to go to Nova and the massacre site, and it felt heavier to me than going to the Holocaust Museum itself. Maybe because it's so fresh, maybe because I'm a parent. But to think of the agony of these parents and what happened, it's unfathomable. What we've seen this past year is we've seen the true power of a demonic propaganda, where all of these, I would say many of them well-intentioned, they believe they're standing with some issue of justice cause, but clearly demonically empowered, useful idiots here in the West protesting not against those who were attacked, not against the people whose daughters were raped and stolen and kidnapped, but protesting in favor of the rapists, of the murderers. Yeah. And it's just amazing to see how the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is becoming the central issue of the whole world. I believe that's by divine design. But what's clear is you have Hamas. It's a terrorist organization. It's an apocalyptically driven Islamic racist hate group. The very charter itself says that its divine destiny is to carry out a genocide against the Jews. It actually says their divine destiny is to slaughter Jews until there's very few left hiding behind a tree or a rock. And then the tree or the rock will cry out and say, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." I mean, the charter of Hamas says Hamas exists to fulfill this divine mandate. And so you have an arguably demonic death cult that attacked Israel, a very secular, liberal people, by and large. And so from a Christian perspective, it's very confusing. Does God love the Palestinian child? Of course he does. Does he love the Palestinian child just as much as he loves the Jewish child? Of course he does. But what's happening right now, this conflict, the insanity of it all, it's so essential that as Christians, that, let me just say this. If our faith, I don't care, what your faith is, if your faith does not lead you to become a good human, then your faith is junk. And as Christians, if our faith doesn't lead us to be good humans and to be good neighbors, regardless as to what our neighbors, believe or otherwise, then our faith is worthless. And if we as Christians are not able to stand with Israel, the global Jewish community in this hour, in the midst of such irrational, demonic hatred and racism, then our faith is worthless. And it's been devastating to me to see Christians getting caught up in the spirit of the age, the propaganda, and demonizing Israel, parroting Marxist propaganda, essentially demonizing them as, colonizers and oppressors and this type of thing. It's just an absolute perversion of reality. Yeah. But to see these young girls, I have 4 daughters, Josh, ages 26 down to 12. To see these girls, some of them in their early 20s, having survived a year of being, kept as prisoners of war by Hamas, many of them sexually assaulted, losing limbs and fingers, coming home to their parents defiantly, "Dad, I came back alive." It's just the triumph of life. The way that these girls are, one of them with their fingers blown off, this becomes the new symbol of I survived. I didn't just survive, I thrived, and I'm smiling. It's been so incredibly inspiring. I'm like, God, as a man in my 50s, I want to be a person of courage like those little girls. I'm just like, they have, as a people, the Israeli people have shown the world how it's done to be a people that stand for what's right. And I just pray that the church will have eyes to see and to stand with the global Jewish community during this hour, because it's been one of the most emotionally stirring, clear moments, moments of moral clarity that I've ever seen in my entire lifetime.
Yeah. Man, it's just, when we went there after, a few months after the October 7th massacre, it was just heartbreaking. Usually I've been there to Israel over 30 times. And so usually, you're going to the Western Wall, you're getting in line for food somewhere. We're kind of like a nuisance, it's like, people are like, all right, Americans are here. And I always felt that way going to the wall in the old cities. It's just, you're in their way. You're just like, come on, like you're coming here to visit, go back home. After October 7th, when we went there in December, people were stopping in their car in the middle of the road, coming out, hugging us, crying, saying, we're so thankful you're here. You showing up is enough. And I think this is our time. We need to stand with Israel. Like you said, we need to show them. We were talking to a group of soldiers, and we said, hey, there may be universities and millions of people around the world that are like, how quick everything flipped on Israel. I remember telling my wife, I'm like, this won't last through the weekend. By Monday, when it rolls around, everyone's going to have turned on Israel. And sadly, that's what happened. But we were with some soldiers, and we said, it looks like everyone has turned their back on you around the world, but we are here and we stand with you, and we're here because we support you. And I think that's the best thing is we can do as Christians right now is stand with the people of Israel, because you're going, as like it's a small country, but people are still wearing this like daily. They have their dog tags, bring them home. There's signs everywhere. it would be like if we were constantly going through 9/11 again and again and again, just reliving, okay, hopefully they can find some more people, or I mean, it's on the top of their minds. I mean, would you say that that's a fair assessment there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, American Jewish parents right now are scared, saying, where can I send my kids to college where they'll be safe in the United States, anywhere in the world? Like, we need to understand what it's like to be Jewish right now. When everything happened, the first thing I did that day, I got on my phone, dumb little thing, but I got on Amazon, I ordered a big Israeli flag. As soon as I got home, I put it in my house. It's been there since. Well, I live in a very Jewish neighborhood. Probably 30% of my neighbors are Jewish.
Oh, wow.
I'm the only person in the whole neighborhood that has anything this past year that identifies my house as standing with Israel. They're all afraid, even in Midwestern conservative United States, And I'll tell you a story. We had the first, Kansas, where I live, we had the first pro-life referendum a few years back after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so I put out some yard signs, pro-life yard signs. I don't usually put up political signs.
Sure.
It caused a conflict in my neighborhood. We have this social media platform called Nextdoor. Yep. And one of my neighbors, who happens to be Jewish and very more politically left, they got really upset. It caused a big hubbub. And, I was very gracious throughout it. I really tried. But it was always cold whenever I saw them. It was like, yeah, they hate me and we don't get along. And, well, I put up the Israeli flag and it's been there, as I said, all year. Well, about 3 months ago, I came home and there was just something at my door. I opened his little package and it was one of those dog tags, bring them home. And it was a note from my neighbors, the very woman that I had the conflict with. And she just said, I want to thank you so much for flying the Israeli flag, for standing with the Jewish people. And, one thing led to another. We've had a few conversations since then, just warm, beautiful conversations. Last time I went to Israel, I came back with some gifts and I brought it to them, and it's changed everything.
Amazing.
And so there's just a beautiful picture of neighbors standing with one another. And I just said to them, I said, look, here we are in the Midwest. Nothing's probably ever going to happen here, but I want you to know, as your neighbor and as a Christian, if anybody in the world ever messes with you, my neighbor, I'm here for you. They're going to go through me first. Like, this Amazing. Is my stance, period. And this is what the global Jewish community needs right now, is they need to see that the church is, in fact, standing with them, standing beside them, before them, behind them, and being good neighbors.
Well said, man. That's powerful. Well, as we're coming to a close here, I would love for you to just share, what's a message you want for our audience here? What's something, Pat, that you're passionate about right now? Whether it's end time stuff, whatever it is, I would love for you to just, if there's a message you'd love to give, what would that be to our audience?
Look, I've got a lot of things swirling around in my life, in my heart, my head. It's an interesting season, a moment right now with President Trump and the political atmosphere in the United States.
Yep.
There's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of an atmosphere where it's kind of funny and fun to make fun of the other side, to do a victory lap and this sort of thing. I would just encourage the church at this moment to remember that our job is to be good neighbors. Our job is to love God and to love other people, and not to get caught up in the moment, not to get caught up in the politics, but to remember that there are souls out there. Like, our job is to love people, and especially those that are oppressed. Like, I'm very pro-Israel.
Yep.
It would be easy for a lot of people to express anti-Palestinian or even anti-Arab comments. And guys, don't do that. Don't give yourself over to that spirit. God loves the Palestinian peoples, the peoples who are suffering, many of them normal people, Christians living in Gaza under the oppressive heavy hand of this demonic death cult. Pray for them. Love your neighbors. I don't care if you're talking your crazy deranged neighbor who's whatever, like the most Marxist, left-wing, anti-Christian person you can imagine, or if it's your very conservative Muslim neighbor, or your liberal Jewish neighbors, or your conservative Jewish neighbors. Like, our job as the church right now is to be a light and salt to the world, and a lot of us are falling down in that, and we need to be good neighbors. We need to be people who don't just love God, but love others as ourselves. So that's really my appeal.
I love it. That's amazing. Well, Joel, thank you so much for jumping on the show. I'd love to have you back on, and so it'd be fun. We'll get my dad on here too. It'd be fun to get you guys on and just hear you guys go back and forth. So, man, thank you for taking the time, and also for you guys listening to the show, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We are now on YouTube. We just launched our YouTube channel, so feel free to go over there and give us a follow, a like, a subscribe, whatever they do over there. And we just thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll see you next week.